you. Hi, I'm Dr. Natasha Noel Liebig. I'm your resident philosopher here at Adams in the HAPPSS department. And I'm here to sponsor Timothy Loosbrock on his project, Should We Prevent Forest Fires? A Question of Ethics, Not of Science. This is actually a project that he got together on his own. It has nothing to do with any of the really class material, well, other than the ethical stuff that he'll be presenting on from intro class to philosophy from last semester. So this is really kind of like his own project that he's ushering in on himself. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Liebig. So, yes, my name is Timothy Loosbrock. I'm currently going to school here at Adams State. I'm a double major in history and philosophy. So I just want to start by giving a little bit of background. So 2018 saw one of the harshest years for forest fires in this country. We're all aware of the amount of forest fires that happened. Everybody was probably aware of the Camp Fire in California. That one was significant because it actually ended up burning down an entire town. There's the Spring Creek Fire in Colorado. That one just happened over by the Beetle Pass, and that one was actually the third largest wildfire in Colorado history. And I want to talk about the U Park Fire in New Mexico for a minute because this one's significant because it was, first of all, kind of the Kickstarter to all those fires, even though it was a bit smaller. But I actually worked fire recovery for the U Park Fire. I spent my summers working down in Cimarron, New Mexico. And so when the U Park Fire came through, I stepped up and I worked fire recovery for a few months there. So one of the things that during this fire recovery was I was part of a team. We were doing all kinds of different, various different projects, and we were all led by conservationists or environmentalists of some sort, either had graduated school or were in grad school for, so they were all these scientists there, and they were able to explain all about fires, how they're beneficial for the ecosystem, how fires can help, how they can be dangerous, why we need to be aware of this. And one of the questions that I always like to ask them, because they would explain to us how fires actually benefited the environment, so I'd ask them, so if fires are good for the environment, should we let these fires burn? To which that question was always met with, and nobody could quite answer that. Nobody quite knew. So that's what I did this project on. That's what my inspiration came from this. With this project, I should note, we're going to be talking about Western North American pine forests. There are forest fires that happen all around the world, not just in the United States and not just in the West, but in the West, in these pine forests, is where we see these massive forest fires that can travel up to 40 miles per hour. So that's why we have this concern today. So moving on from there, I just want to give a brief history of the actual history of conservation. So right here, this man right here is John Muir. John Muir was the first philosopher to really write on the environment, really advocating for preservation. He believed that the environment was this whole nother being, that it could actually we could have a spiritual connection with nature when you go into the environment. So he wrote on this idea that actually we can benefit through therapeutic, we can have a closer relationship with God in the forest. Now we have Gifford Pinchot, this man right here down on the right. Gifford Pinchot is another philosopher who actually was kind of Muir's counterpart in a lot of this. Pinchot wrote a lot on conservation. He recognized that the forest was more, he didn't see it as a being, he saw it more as a thing. We actually got resources from the environment. So then on top of all this, we have President Theodore Roosevelt. President Theodore Roosevelt was responsible for kind of kickstarting the National Park Service during the Progressive Era. He is the one that ended up, when he started founding these national parks like Yellowstone, Yosemite, Devil's Tower, when we start doing this, then we start seeing a real boom in the environmental recreation outdoors industry. So what is preservation and conservation? Well, preservation, to give a brief overview, is that what Muir believes the forest requires protection, the same way that we protect ourselves. If the forest is this being, we should protect it like we protect ourselves. We have an army to defend ourselves from outside forces, and the forest should have the same thing. He actually wanted the forest to have a patrolled border, which to an extent is actually what happened. With this, we have a patrolled border like what we do now with the National Park Service. We have park rangers and conservationists out there who are constantly patrolling that border, looking for any possible threats to the environment and the forest out there. He also believed that the forest was able to sustain itself as its own living being that can survive without the assistance of humanity. And this he's totally right in it. I mean, the forest was here long before we were, and it's going to be here long after we're gone. So he is right. Nature can sustain itself. But on the other hand, you have conservation. Conservation it was what Pinchot argued. He believed that the forest provided resources necessary for expansion. He recognized that we actually needed to use the forest in order to grow ourselves as humans. So he said what wasn't required, protection of the forest wasn't required, it was actually regulation was. We had to put these restrictions on ourselves so we didn't eat away this finite amount of resources. So with this, he's talking about humanity's greed and that we should take only what is necessary and give back what we can. We should actually try to work with the environment. So after Roosevelt, Muir left an impact that resided with many Americans. We suddenly have people who want to have these spiritual connections with nature, and it starts with the elite members of society going out and building hunting cabins out there in the woods. When they start to do this, they put their own invested interest in protecting the forests, which is totally reasonable, and we have the national parks begin to profit off of travelers. When we start having this revenue coming in from the National Park Service, suddenly the state now has an interest in protecting where the money is coming from. So Muir's preservation was beginning to become the popular philosophy for all of forest ethics, and with preservation, we as humans trapped the bug that was the forest underneath the glass. That was our idea of protection with preservation. So what I mean by that, let's just really quickly recap this. We have our anthropocentric model, or biocentric, and our ecocentric. So we all are a part of this ecocentric model. We have the anthropocentric right here. That's where a lot of people tend to just focus on other humans, and we have the biocentric, focusing on other animals, other creatures. All on top of that is the ecocentric, and that's what we want to look at when we're talking about this. Now I just want to explain how forest fires happen. So naturally, what we want to start here with this new growth process. With this new growth process, trees come up and they begin to create a forest floor. They benefit off of one another. They evolve into a habitat for other creatures to come. The trees will shed their pine needles, their pine cones. Sick trees might die and fall over. And eventually, that starts to build up on the forest floor. And when you get that, you get what's called old growth. When old growth happens, it's like having mucus in your body. You need to clear out your mucus. So the medication for that is a healthy fire. A healthy fire will come in and it'll typically just stay on the forest floor. It won't really burn down all these massive amounts of trees. It might kill the weak trees that probably need to die. It'll kill any parasites that could be growing on the trees. But healthy fire will ultimately, as you can see when we get new growth, we see some dead trees and we see some live trees that are still growing tall. So ultimately, healthy fires will end up being smaller, but better. Now, this is where we get a brief history of Smokey the Bear. And I want to say when Smokey the Bear was actually first created, it was actually a pretty good thing to have for the American people because he was essentially the mascot for the Forest Service and he advocated to control your campfires. Don't leave your cigarettes on the ground like still lit. Don't burn your trash in the woods. I mean, these are, I think, no-brainers, but you know, it's still good to have a mascot. So what he said, though, is only you can prevent wildfires. When you have a mascot like this, what he's essentially telling kids is that it is our duty as humans to prevent any fire that may start in the forest, regardless if that fire is caused by man or natural causes. So what this is saying here is that this is our duty as humans. We were put on this planet to protect the environment. Any danger that might come near it, it's our job to put it out. So now Smokey has disrupted the forest cycle, and we see this buildup on the forest floor. Essentially what Smokey the Bear has done, he's created a powder keg in the forest, and now that powder keg can be volatile to anything. So here's some conservation in practice just briefly. This is what I spent my summer doing. So we have fire recovery. That's actually a pretty new idea, the thought of actually going into a burned area and starting to replant, starting regrowth, just to kind of push that process along. We have timber stand improvement too. When you have too dense of a forest, you must go in and you have a workforce, clear out the forest. They will typically cut down whatever excess of trees there are, cut down the weaker trees. And so in this picture right here, it's probably hard to tell. This is actually a forest that after we did TSI. And you probably can't see it, but there's some little tree stumps in there that are cut off. And what you see is a lot more opening of a forest. It's a lot clearer, a lot more breathable air. The trees can have room to grow. And then that leads to slash piles burning, what you see over here. Basically a prescription burn. Prescription burn is like how you get a prescription note from your doctor. Same thing with the forest, an ecologist will prescribe a prescription burn, and they're monitored, they're overseen, and usually they end up being just fine. No problems with prescription burns. They've rarely gotten out of control, and even when they do, it's not a big deal. But what they do is they provide that nutrients back into the soil, similarly to how we have an actual fire come through. Now, this is the U Park fire, and this area right over here is entirely black. That's where the fire came, and you can see this sort of break right around here where it starts to be green again, and in this green area is actually where conservation was practiced. We had some fire recovery, some timber stand improvement practice there prior to the fire, and that's where the fire happened to break off. So we can't say, we haven't had this 100+ years of conservation like we have with preservation, but we can immediately see some short-term impacts that it has. And it's a good thing, by the way, that it did, because these buildings right down here could have been burned by the fire had it not been if we'd been practicing timber stand improvement up there. Now, how does this relate all back to philosophy? So, this is what ties into ethics, and I want to go back to Immanuel Kant, sort of the beginning philosopher when you're talking about ethics. So, really what we want to declare is that if we're going to have these forest fires stop, if we want people to take care of the forest, then we must make it a moral law, a moral duty. So if the law is to be a moral law, that is, to be the basis of an obligation, then it must be of absolute necessity. Now, reason applies to everybody. We're all reasonable humans. We can all think, we can all reason. So therefore, it's absolute and universal. Now, morality, or moral laws, then, is going to be fundamentally connected to reason. We are obligated to act upon something. We have it to do with sense of duty. So, to use a kind of example for this, if you see somebody being attacked, you have the sense of duty to step in, because we all are obligated. That's a moral law. No state, no government needs to tell us, oh yes, attacking someone is bad, because we just know it. We know that that's wrong. It's our moral duty to try and prevent that when we can. Now, this is where we have Nell Noddings. Nell Noddings is a different, she was a 20th century philosopher and feminist, and she wrote a lot on care ethics. Now, this is a different idea from what Kant was saying. She makes the distinction between the one caring and the one cared for. And the best way that you can think about this is sort of like taking care of a baby or an elderly person. So what she essentially says is that where we act on behalf of the other is because we want to do so. We're acting in accord with natural caring. So this is where we get an I must in here. When you see somebody being attacked, you get this overwhelming feeling, this overwhelming urge of, I must step in, I must confront that. However, what she says is, instead of waiting for this feeling of I must, can we instead demand care? I must suddenly becomes something must be done. Maybe we don't have that overwhelming feeling to step in and say this needs to be done, but we can recognize there's a problem and we say something must be done. So with that, with the forest, rather than waiting for this I must with environmental ethics, suddenly we want to move to something must be done. Now, how does this relate back more to the forest? Let's talk about every species has a right to live. Whether, and we say all beings here, and I specify beings up here, because this includes women, African American, dominant ethnicities, etc. All people have equal rights. Whether that's shown in this world or not in some areas, we do fundamentally all have equal rights as humans. But then this leads into the concept of speciesism. We tend to favor our own species over every other one. And this is true because when we have, say, ourselves versus a cow, well, I think most people can agree that we will slaughter the cow to feed ourselves. And that's kind of an act of speciesism, much like racism to a little extent. While speciesism is this idea that comes into philosophy much later, I will say I am totally specious against the deer in this town. So, we must strive to treat all beings as equal, despite if these beings are rational or not. the best way I like to say this is, well, how should we take care of these species? If they're not us, they're not rational, they don't have morals. Well, what about a baby? We take care of a baby. A baby has no morality. A baby has no reasoning with it. A baby's a baby, but we know that it's a being nonetheless. We know that even though it doesn't have morality, we know to still take care of this baby. So, with that, is the forest its own being? Can we say, just because it might not show morality, can we say that we do have this overwhelming urge of something must be done in order to protect the forest? So, to talk about if the forest is a being, here's what I have. Here's right over here is just a stream breaking off, and over here are some human blood vessels. We can see how right here the water is actually much like the blood of the human system. So while it might not show itself right away, we can't argue that, yeah, there is somewhat of a link here between our own bodies and the forest. And similarly, I'd also like to say, these are human cells. Each individual cell is not a being, has no morality, has no reason or logic, and similarly with the trees. A single tree, maybe it's living, maybe it's not, it's just kind of a thing. But when we group together a whole bunch of human cells, we create our own beings. We know we're beings, and we come from the building blocks of these cells. So similarly, with the forest is complex. It works in very intrinsic and different ways. So maybe a single tree isn't necessarily a being, but when you get them grouped together, they work on cycles. They work off of each other. They end up actually benefiting from one another. There's multiple organisms that benefit off the forest. So, that being said, maybe the forest isn't a being that can move around and speak like I do, but much like a baby, we can argue that it's a being, and therefore, if it's a being, we have this intrinsic duty to take care of it. So, here's how this plays out on a bigger scale. Here we have all of these different sort of values to have. Right out here, if we say that the forest is a being, much like how John Muir was saying that it is a being, then it has intrinsic values and it plays a bigger role. Then we have our instrumental values here. This is where we might sit with conservation a little bit. And then here the self-centered is where a lot of people like climate change deniers might sit. They just don't care what happens. So if the forest is a bigger being, we have this intrinsic duty to actually take care of it for its value. So it seems we have this duty to protect the forest. We cannot wait for the I must. Instead, something must be done. We recognize that now. So if John Muir said that the forest was its own being, as we continue to study, science finds that the forest is far more complex than we actually originally understood it to be. If the forest is its own being, then we have a moral obligation to take care of the forest. So, I'd really quickly like to talk the bigger question here. Forest fires are a natural disaster, just like hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes. Yet, we can prevent a forest fire, but we can't prevent an earthquake from happening. So that leads to a bit of a moral question within the anthropocentric model of, are the mountain towns of Colorado and the ranchers in Montana doomed to the same fate as those living on the San Andreas Fault? Or, if we have the ability to prevent forest fires, are we morally obligated to do so? And do we have a right to decide what's best for nature if it does have this intrinsic value that we've determined that it does have? So I'd like to end this with one of my favorites. So this is another environmental philosopher, Edward Abbey, and he says, "God bless America. Let's try to save some of it." Thank you. Yes?
So I have a question. When you reference nodding, so you say that we need to go from I must do to something must be done. Do you think that kind of philosophy is going to lead to nothing getting done because you're not placing blame onto yourself or onto like pinpointing a specific problem and saying this is going to be solved X, Y, Z, and this is how we're going to do it?
So it's interesting that you say that because I actually know Lottings, when you do read her work, she actually does explain that when we say something must be done, we tend to then just drop it and ignore it. It's one of the kind of critiques of hers. However, what I would actually argue is that a bit of a critique for nodding with my argument is that we have these intrinsic values to play with the forest, and we can't wait for this something must be, or I must do something, because when we do that, the forest is already burning. The forest is already getting deforested by logging companies, and it's getting damaged by the mines out there. So we recognize something must be done. And from something must be done, then if we can play a bigger role within ourselves, we recognize if something must be done, I must do something.
Where does your research go from here? Are you interested in connecting this to Eastern or other philosophies or ethical standpoints or points of view?
So, what I was alluding to with comparing the forest to actually human stem cells, really I think where my research goes from here is it progresses into calling into a re-understanding of how we understand the forest. Calling into the fact that the forest is a being, and if it's a being, we need to treat it like such. Right now, a lot of philosophers will argue that the forest is still its own, it's still this inanimate object, but it is important nonetheless. And many scientists will probably agree that there's life in there and the forest gives off life, but the forest itself might not be its own being. A tree might be a being. So I would like to further my research into saying that yes, our understanding of what is a being alludes further past just us, further past just animals, and goes all the way to really nature in and of itself, and stuff like the forest.
What about CO2 emissions now? Is that playing a role in how we conceptualize what to do with forest fires?
Yeah, so CO2 and climate change is definitely one of the bigger impacts that we need to focus on. It's one of the more demanding issues in our society today. And one of the things is that we tend to view the earth itself as not necessarily this kind of living being. And this really starts with forests. So forests play a larger role in actually fighting climate change. They're able to help move the carbon cycle along, kind of regulate temperatures, and with practices like deforestation or even wildfires that end up burning down all of this land, we have less trees to actually be able to produce this healthy oxygen. So what we need to do is we need to move to recognize that if the forest is a being, then we need to help with forest efforts, and part of that is with CO2 emissions. Yes?
So along the lines of speciesism, so you're talking about the forest being a being, but there's the pine beetle outbreak. So where do you lie on ethics? Like, do you think of the forest as the bigger, or do you focus on the pine beetle because it's a contributing factor to forest fires? So where do you?
So the pine beetle is actually, first of all, an invasive species, and second of all, is really another, I didn't allude to it, but it's actually another similar to forest fires. It's able to kill off these vast amounts of trees rapidly, quickly. So much like a forest fire, the pine beetle is more of kind of the living embodiment of a forest fire, I guess you could say. And where that stands is ultimately, we ask more of a question of, well, if we have, say, an innocent animal, a duck, but yet at the same time we see a pack of wolves wanting to attack it, do we step in to defend this endangered species of the duck? Because the species isn't endangered, and we need to protect it. But at the same time, that wolf is its natural predator. So that's where I would say more of your morals and your ethics would lie. I would say my morals and ethics might lie more in protecting the bigger picture, the ecocentric model.
That's all the time we have for questions.
All right, thank you.